I used to think that silence meant stability, that when a marriage grew quiet, it was a sign of comfort. Two people who didn't need to fill the air with noise just to feel connected. But I've learned that silence has many shades. Sometimes silence is soft and companionable, and sometimes it's sharp enough to cut you open. I'm Graham Ellison, and this is how I bled out over the course of 18 years without realizing it. I'm an auditor, someone who's paid to notice what others overlook. Fractions of cents, dates that don't match, handwriting that looks off. I deal in inconsistencies, and I've built a reputation for exposing fraud. But the truth is, I miss the biggest one of all, the emotional kind. Karina, my wife, used to call me safe. She meant it as a compliment. Back then, she liked that I didn't make messes, that I was dependable, predictable. But what you learn slowly over time is that predictability becomes invisible. And eventually, the person who once made her feel secure becomes the person she quietly resents for being boring. I didn't notice the drift at first. It's not like one day she stopped loving me. It's more like she started loving someone else, gradually, in the spaces where I wasn't paying attention. It started with the usual cliches. New workout routines. Cryptic texts she said were from coworkers. A sudden interest in interior decorating. Books left open on the kitchen table about finding passion after 40. Then came the guarded phone. A lock screen she'd never needed before. The shower at night. The change in perfume. Something sharper, more deliberate. She picked fights over things we used to laugh about. Questioned my spending, even when I knew she was the one pulling money from our accounts. Once, she accused me of micromanaging, said it felt like being married to a spreadsheet. It stung, because part of me knew it was true. But another part knew that wasn't the reason she was pulling away. Then came the text. It was a Thursday night. She was in the shower. Her phone buzzed once, then again. The light hit the screen just right. I didn't mean to look, but I did. Tell him anything. I miss you. 7 words. That's all. No name. No emojis. No guilt. There was no panic in me, only stillness. Like a doctor who's found the tumor on the scan and knows it's inoperable. I took a screenshot, emailed it to myself. Then I stood there for a long time, letting the water run, letting the silence between us harden into a kind of truth. She came out of the shower humming. She didn't notice my expression. She never asked what I'd been doing. That told me everything I needed to know. But here's the thing, I didn't confront her. I didn't yell or accuse or beg. Because confrontation is for people who still think there's something to save. I didn't want a confession. I wanted clarity. And that meant watching. Waiting. Tracking the patterns. That weekend, while she went to visit a friend in Bend, a friend I had no evidence existed, I opened my laptop and logged into our banking dashboard. It was time to see what the numbers knew that I didn't. One transaction stood out. $1,750 transferred from our joint account to J. Keller Savings. I didn't recognize the name, but the routing number led to a credit union in Eugene, a city neither of us had ties to. The ledger wasn't lying. I knew now that the truth was there, coded, buried in withdrawals, receipts, aliases. What I didn't know was how far it went. But I was ready to find out. I started building a map. Not of locations, but of transactions. Because money, unlike people, doesn't lie. It leaves a trail, and Karina had been very, very busy. That first odd transfer, $1,750 to J. Keller Savings, opened a door. And what I found on the other side made the truth unavoidable. Over the next 10 nights, while she slept soundly in the same bed, I became 2 men. One who kissed her cheek before turning off the light, and one who quietly cataloged her deception while the city outside went still. I worked in spreadsheets, not emotion. Every transaction was a puzzle piece. By the end of the second week, the picture had become sharp enough to recognize, and sickeningly familiar. $11,000 diverted to an account in her maiden name. $4,500 wired to a man named A. Colby in Nevada. $3,200 in boutique hotel charges she claimed were work conferences. Except the conference in question didn't exist. A paperless trail of betrayal. I searched for signs of coercion, of manipulation, anything that might have painted her as a victim of someone else's scheme. But it was worse than that. This wasn't something done to Karina. This was who she had become. She had carefully constructed a secondary financial identity. Small recurring deposits and cash withdrawals. Multiple credit cards with payment histories, just long enough to avoid suspicion. And, most tellingly, she never touched my 401k, my pension, or my separate brokerage, not because she was being kind, but because she was being strategic. She wanted to take what wouldn't draw legal fire. I found a storage unit in Tigard under the business name Klein and Vale Wellness LLC. She'd signed for it using a digital signature tied to her alternate email. I drove out there the next morning. Didn't go in. Just stood across the street and stared at it for a long time. Because I knew whatever was inside wasn't just property. It was intent. Back at home, Karina was preparing for a women's weekend at the coast. She kissed me goodbye and thanked me for being so understanding lately. And I smiled, not out of warmth but calculation. That night, I called Avery Juneau, a lawyer I'd once audited as a favor. He'd handled 3 high-net-worth divorces and a fraud case involving a municipal executive. I told him I needed discretion, quiet preparation, and a full picture of what I was legally entitled to. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Send me what you have." So I did. The screenshots, the ledger, the recordings, the emails she thought were deleted. And when he called me back the next morning, his first words were, "You've done my job for me. She's made every mistake you hoped she would." That day, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, clarity. This wasn't about catching her anymore. It was about controlling the fallout. I began documenting my digital footprint at home, screen recording my bank logins, backed up every file to 2 encrypted drives, one hidden in my desk at work, the other mailed to my brother in Seattle. Karina, meanwhile, floated through the house like she was already living someone else's life. And maybe she was. But so was I. Because the man she thought she married, the quiet one, the safe one, the one who wouldn't fight, that man was gone. And the one who replaced him? He had a plan. The night before I filed for divorce, I cooked her favorite meal. Braised lamb, garlic potatoes, a bitter green salad tossed with cranberries and pecans. Just how she liked it. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was feeding her comfort, even as I prepared to take everything apart. She didn't suspect a thing. She walked through the door wearing that same self-satisfied grin, dressed in athletic where that still had the price tag string tucked beneath her top. Lululemon, naturally, but the receipt in our bank log said cash withdrawal. $340, Pearl District. She hadn't paid in credit. She was hiding the trail. Again. "Wow, this looks incredible," she said as she stepped out of her shoes, casually kissing me on the cheek. I nodded. Felt like a home-cooked night. We sat. We ate. She laughed, performed really, talking about her friend Marissa's messy divorce, and how she hoped we'd never become those people. I almost choked on my wine. But I kept smiling. I had mastered it, the auditor's smile. Warm, harmless, perfectly disarming. The kind of smile that never hints it's already marked you for audit. Because I wasn't planning to fight her. I was planning to isolate the contamination and surgically remove it. The next morning, at precisely 8:45 a.m., Avery filed the petition. At 9 o'clock, the financial hold was activated across all co-owned accounts. By 9:30, the standing order froze her access to the joint home equity line. By 10 o'clock, 3 banks had flagged her recent personal transfers for audit. And by noon, I had replaced every login credential she might still possess with fresh, randomized alphanumeric strings, stored offline. That afternoon, I handed her the manila envelope. She opened it in the kitchen, where sunlight touched only half her face, the rest caught in shadow. I watched her eyes move over the court header, the motion title, the attached exhibits. Then she froze, then blinked. And then came the sound, not rage, not tears, but stunned silence. That long, hollow pause of a woman who finally understood she'd lost the script. "You're divorcing me?" she said, voice like a bad actress in a low-budget drama. I stayed calm. Not because I wasn't angry, I was. But rage was noisy, and this required quiet precision. "I've given you months of rope," I said. "You chose to hang something with it." Her face shifted from shock to insult. She lashed out. "You went through my accounts? You stalked me?" "No," I replied evenly. "I traced discrepancies. It's what I do. It just so happened the trail led straight to you." I saw it, the first glimmer of fear. Because this wasn't the scenario she had expected. She had planned for confrontation. For a wounded man who might yell or beg or storm out. She hadn't planned for me. A man who had studied her betrayal like a forensic file, who had turned their marriage into a controlled demolition with no collateral damage. I didn't engage her theatrics. No shaming. No emotional bargaining. No, how could you? That would have given her power, the illusion of shared responsibility. Instead, I let the documents speak. Filed. Labeled. Chronologically ordered. Every lie she'd told, every financial manipulation, every breadcrumb. She slammed the envelope on the counter and walked out. I watched her drive off without a word. In the days that followed, her reaction fractured into stages. Outrage, then charm, then finally desperation. She texted me late at night. "We can fix this." She emailed. "This is extreme. You've always overreacted when you felt controlled." She even had her sister call, implying I'd gone cold and was being vindictive. But the one thing Karina couldn't seem to process was this. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was executing. I updated my estate documents, revoked her medical proxy, closed the living trust she didn't know I had altered the year prior. She wasn't just leaving my life, she was being written out of the architecture of it. And when her attorney finally called Avery to open dialogue, Avery said something I'll never forget. "My client doesn't want to fight. He wants a record. You should be very careful what you try to bury, because he's probably already holding it." She left the house within a week. Took only what she could prove was hers. I didn't stop her, because I knew what she left behind told me more than anything she took. Like the unused checkbooks from her second account, the old burner phone, still tucked in the drawer beneath the guest towels, and her journal, half burned in the trash bin. I didn't read it, because I didn't need to understand her anymore. I had already understood what mattered, her intent, her strategy, her underestimation of me. But what I didn't fully understand, not yet, was how much financial ruin she might have still hidden. And 2 weeks later, I found out. The letter came in a plain envelope. No return address. No logo. Just my name, typed in cheap toner and slightly misaligned, like it had been spit out of a discount printer in a hurry. Inside was a collections notice. Final notice. Payment delinquent on personal loan #C89-471K issued through Timberlake Credit Union. Co-signatory Graham Kell. I stared at the paper like it had arrived from a parallel life. $42,300 outstanding. Originated 14 months ago. Purpose, Startup Capital. Primary signer, Karina Kell. Co-signed digitally, by me? I checked the signature. My name was there, sure, but the date, the device ID, the IP address? Not mine. Not even close. She had forged it. Sloppily, too. She hadn't even used my legal signature. Just a scanned copy of it, probably pulled from old mortgage docs. I should have felt rage. Panic. But what I felt was familiarity. Because this wasn't a new betrayal. This was her signature sin, dressing deceit in administrative clothing. I contacted Timberlake Credit's fraud division and opened a case. They were cautious at first, standard policy. But once I provided timestamps, my travel logs from the day of the signature, and the IP trail proving she'd signed it from a device registered to Klein and Vale Wellness LLC, they escalated the case to legal. It wasn't the only letter that arrived. Over the next 10 days, I received a past due notice from a boutique office supply vendor tied to a fake business license application, a tax delinquency alert from the Oregon Secretary of State's office for a shell corporation I had no involvement in, and most damning, a credit pull initiated by a loan servicer in Nevada that had attempted to refinance our home using my identity after the divorce was filed. Karina had tried to weaponize debt. I wasn't just cleaning up after her lies anymore. I was trapped inside her abandoned schemes. Schemes that were never meant to be discovered, because she hadn't expected me to file first. Because she'd assumed I'd freeze, confused, ashamed, overwhelmed. But I didn't freeze. I documented everything. I created a forensic reconstruction timeline. Loan origination dates. Known travel history. Digital device locations. I collected screen recordings, call logs, screenshots of legal filings, and timestamps from the day she signed my name. And when I had enough, when the pattern was no longer speculation but a case, I returned to Avery. He took one look at the pile and said, "We don't fight this through banks. We fight this in court. And we do it publicly." But I hesitated. Part of me still wasn't sure if I wanted the scorched earth version. Not because she didn't deserve it, but because I didn't know what revenge would actually feel like when it was finally mine. Avery said something else then. Justice isn't about hurting her. It's about removing her power to hurt you again. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't about emotional closure. This was about institutional insulation. I wasn't fighting my ex-wife anymore. I was fighting a paper version of me she had tried to create. A financial ghost she built to float loans, dodge taxes, and protect her image. It was time to kill that ghost, legally, surgically, and finally. I drafted affidavits, signed deposition-ready statements, and authorized Avery to initiate a civil suit for financial fraud and identity misuse. We subpoenaed the banks, pulled metadata from every flagged document, and filed to seek damages, restitution, and public correction of credit liabilities. The dominoes were already falling, but not all of them in her direction, because during the final audit, something else surfaced. A shared property Karina had purchased in cash under her name, but with marital funds. A tiny craftsman home in Eugene. She had transferred it to a trust 3 weeks before I filed. Held under a different name, but bought with our money. She had hidden it thinking I'd never find it. But I did. And now, it was back on the table. I never wanted revenge. I wanted the record set straight, not in whispers between friends, not in bitter texts at 2 a.m., but in official documents, in signed orders, in court transcripts no one could distort. I wanted my name cleared, my credit restored, my narrative returned to me. And that meant I had to become someone she never expected. A man who didn't just survive betrayal, but documented it, systematized it, and held it to the fire until all that remained was fact. Avery called it quiet lawfare. No headlines, no drama, just precise application of accountability, asset by asset, lie by lie. We filed the civil suit with a deliberate tone. Not vengeful, not inflammatory, just documented misconduct, clean and clinical. The court granted our discovery motion. Karina was ordered to provide full financial disclosures within 30 days. She stalled, tried to drag it out, so we filed a compulsion order, citing failure to comply in bad faith. At the same time, I began the long work of reputational repair. I wrote sworn statements to all 3 credit bureaus, attached copies of forged loan documents, submitted the forensic metadata showing altered IP logs and digital forgeries, worked with a financial attorney to draft a permanent fraud block across all future credit applications using my name. In parallel, Timberlake Credit Union reclassified the fraudulent loan as a criminal matter and reported it to state investigators. Karina, meanwhile, had gone quiet. No more emails. No late-night manipulations. The curated light and energy life coach facade had begun to fracture once real scrutiny arrived. Avery met with her lawyer, who floated the idea of private settlement. He hinted that Karina was overwhelmed, that she'd agree to waive alimony if we dropped the fraud suit. I said no, not because I needed the money, but because walking away without a ruling meant giving her the luxury of ambiguity. She didn't get to leave a smudge on my name and then disappear into the next version of herself, free from consequence. The court date approached. In that courtroom, I didn't come to perform. I came to verify. Karina's defense was thin, something about emotional confusion, a vague mention of me being too controlling with finances. But the paper trail didn't care about emotional narratives. The judge reviewed our evidence, the forged applications, the faked IP logs, the unauthorized transfers. He looked at Karina and asked directly, "Did you obtain consent from your husband for this financial activity?" Her silence was louder than any denial. She looked at the floor, didn't answer. And in that moment, it was over. The judgment was swift. The Eugene property was ordered into equal division, its hidden status cited as an act of intentional concealment. The fraudulent loans were declared solely her responsibility, and the court issued a formal statement of misconduct. The respondent engaged in a sustained pattern of financial deception and unauthorized use of the petitioner's identity, causing both economic and reputational harm. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just breathed, like I was finally standing up in a room where I'd been sitting in shame for years. But the part that surprised me the most? What I felt after the ruling wasn't triumph. It was stillness. Everything I'd been working toward, the exposure, the legal recognition, the unraveling of her illusions, had finally happened. And it didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like a door quietly closing behind me. I walked out of that courtroom knowing 2 things. She couldn't touch me anymore. And I didn't need to explain what happened ever again. Because now there was a record. Filed, stamped, and legally binding. Karina would go on with her curated life. But she'd do so with a very real footnote attached to her legacy. one she couldn't erase with a filtered photo or a soft-spoken apology. And me? I had work to do. Not legal work. Personal work. There was still a house to clear of old memories. Still a name to rebuild beyond the context of what she'd done to it. Still silence to face, the kind that comes after a long, brutal storm when the winds stop and you're left asking, what now? I didn't know what healing looked like. I just knew I didn't want to become a monument to what she did to me. The court filings were closed. The property was split. My name was cleared. And still, I found myself pacing around a quiet house as if I'd forgotten how to sit still. There's no manual for what to do after justice. No therapist's workbook on what it feels like when the noise stops and all that remains is you. Not the version that survived, but the one who has to start living again. I stood in the garage one morning, a place I used to escape to during her meditative sound baths and passive-aggressive silences, and opened a plastic bin I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photos from my backpacking days through Patagonia, before I'd ever heard the word chakras. Receipts from cafes in Prague, when I still believed in novelty. A notebook full of financial models I'd built just for fun, not for survival. That version of me hadn't vanished. He'd just been buried under years of emotional negotiation. Trade-offs made quietly to maintain the appearance of peace. And now, with nothing left to hold together, I started digging him out. I made small moves first. I canceled the joint gym membership I'd kept paying out of habit. Replaced the furniture in the guest room where I'd slept during the final months of the marriage. Deleted every meditation playlist she ever added to my phone. It wasn't bitterness. It was clearing space, for air, for silence, for new rituals. I also did something that surprised even me. I enrolled in a short-term course at a local college. Behavioral economics. Night classes. No commitment. I didn't need the credential. I needed the exercise of choice, something done not out of defense, not for legal strategy, but because I wanted to. And in those fluorescent-lit classrooms, surrounded by students half my age and twice as restless, I felt something new. Not youth. Not regret. Curiosity. I found myself reading again, not headlines, not legal clauses, but stories. Novels. Biographies. History. I even started journaling, a habit I used to mock. But when you've spent years being misquoted in your own life, there's something sacred about documenting your thoughts just for yourself. One morning, as spring broke over Portland like a slow yawn, I made a list. Not a financial ledger. Not a legal plan. A list of what I missed about myself. The way I used to cook without measuring. The satisfaction of small, unacknowledged wins. The quiet satisfaction of being misunderstood, because I hadn't tried to explain myself in the first place. I didn't write "be happy." I wrote "be whole." Happiness was fleeting. Wholeness was sustainable. There were still remnants of her everywhere. A silk scarf in a coat pocket. A scent that clung to old furniture. A voicemail I hadn't deleted. But I stopped treating those things like threats. They were just proof of what I endured, not anchors. One Sunday afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my neighborhood for no reason. No destination. No step count. And as I passed families, runners, elderly couples walking in silence, I realized something. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I'd been through. They didn't care. And that anonymity was freedom. In a small cafe on Hawthorne, weeks later, I sat alone reading a book when a woman asked if she could share the table. I said yes. Not because I needed company, but because I wasn't afraid of it anymore. We didn't talk much. She worked on her laptop. I finished my espresso. But as she left, she smiled, not flirtatiously, not suggestively. Just kindly. It struck me that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt kindness without cost. And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't rebuilding. I was becoming. The hardest part isn't surviving what someone did to you. It's deciding who you're going to be now that they're gone. Not just from your life, but from your voice, your story, your reflection. For months, I had made rebuilding my mission. Cleaning credit. Correcting records, reclaiming my routines. But after all the scorched earth had cooled, I was still here. Not undone. Not angry. Just unfinished. Because justice isn't the same as closure. And closure isn't the same as identity. So I did what I hadn't done in years. I stopped fixing things, and I started listening. To myself. At first, it was subtle. I noticed when I didn't instinctively shrink in a conversation. When I voiced an opinion without calculating whether it would escalate tension. when I no longer scanned a room for emotional temperature like I was walking through a minefield. I realized that I'd been operating with defensive programming for so long, managing energy, not expressing it. Karina had left behind no physical bruises, but her emotional blueprint had written itself across the way I paused before speaking, the way I used to apologize for things I didn't do, the way I once questioned my gut every time it whispered, "This doesn't feel right." I was finally in a place where I could ask, who am I when I'm not being managed, blamed, or minimized? One night, I sat in my backyard under the string lights I'd hung alone after she left. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until you remember what it used to cover. I looked up at the stars, the same sky I used to numb myself beneath, wondering how I became the stranger in my own marriage. And I made a choice, to stop being the man who healed as proof to others that he could, and instead become the man who lives simply because he deserves to. I started keeping promises to myself again. I got up early and ran, not for discipline, but for clarity. I turned my morning coffee into a ritual instead of a habit. I deleted her number, her photos, and every digital breadcrumb that led back to the version of me who tolerated erosion for the illusion of peace. I began mentoring a young accountant in my firm, not because I had to, but because it felt good to build someone else up without being drained. I joined a book club, just a small group that met once a month at a pub downtown. They didn't care what I'd survived. They only cared what I thought of the story. That was enough. And slowly, I became undeniably myself again. Not the man before her. Not the man broken by her. But the man formed through it all, tempered, clarified, rebuilt without apology. I didn't need to announce this to anyone. I just lived it. When people asked if I was seeing someone new, I said, "I'm seeing my life clearly." That's enough for now. I stopped defining time as before her and after her. She wasn't a central axis anymore. She was just a chapter. And I was finally writing the next one, in my own handwriting. Peace isn't forgetting what happened. It's no longer needing it to mean more than it does. For a long time, everything I did was in response to her. Protecting my assets, rebuilding my credit, reclaiming my voice. Every step was a reaction, even the quiet, dignified ones. Even the legal ones. But then one morning, as I stood barefoot on the porch, coffee in hand, the dog snoring inside, my phone quiet, I realized something startling. I hadn't thought about her in days. Not because I suppressed her memory. Not because I'd rewritten the past. But because I no longer needed her betrayal to explain me. It had shaped me. It had tested me. But it no longer defined me. That's what completion feels like. Not a door slamming shut, but a door that's been open so long you forget it ever closed. I had begun living forward, without resistance. I rearranged the house. Not because I had to erase the past, but because it was my space now. I planted herbs in the backyard, started cooking again. The way I used to before our meals became silent performances. I went to therapy not to unpack trauma, but just to reflect, to be witnessed by someone with no stake in the outcome. And I wrote. Not memoirs. Not takedowns. Just observations. Thoughts. Gratitude lists sometimes. A quiet record of a man slowly, gently, returning to himself. There was no cinematic reunion with an old flame. No viral moment of look how far I've come. But one afternoon, while helping my neighbor carry boxes into her garage, she offered me a cup of lemonade. We sat on the stoop and talked about nothing for half an hour. Her son's graduation, the price of lumber, her dog's arthritis. When I got up to leave, she said, "You seem like someone who sleeps well." And it caught me off guard. Because I did. I finally did. And it showed. I didn't need a parade. I didn't need closure from her. I didn't even need the old version of me back. All I needed was exactly what I had. A life with no double meanings. A calendar that belonged only to me. A voice I didn't second guess. And a heart that wasn't waiting to be rescued, because it had already come home. Completion is quiet. It's not the finish line. It's the moment you realize you're no longer running. It is the summary epilogue. Graham Latner never planned to become the central figure in a story of betrayal and strategic justice. A disciplined financial analyst from Portland, he built a quiet life on logic, predictability, and loyalty, until his wife Karina rerouted their marriage with lies, manipulation, and financial treachery. What began with late-night inconsistencies and secretive withdrawals turned into a full-blown dismantling of trust. Through 8 phases, Graham went from betrayed husband to tactical executor, uncovering Karina's double life, reclaiming his assets, exposing her fraud, and walking away, not just from her, but from the version of himself that tolerated erosion for the sake of peace. But The Ledger of Me is not a revenge tale. It's a story of strategic redirection and personal reconstitution, where justice is pursued not to hurt the betrayer, but to restore the betrayed. By the end, Graham doesn't just survive his marriage. He evolves beyond it, no longer defined by the wounds she left or the vindication he achieved. He lives. Fully. Quietly. Entirely. Not as a man who lost a wife, but as one who finally came back to himself.